Okay, before I start another latest episode of As the Joe Budden World Turns, or the Joe Budden Podcast World Turns. This is like a soap opera, folks. Uh, before I begin, I first like to state this, and I state this in every video. I feel like all three of these individuals handled it the wrong way. Okay? And I can list the ways and count the ways on how all three of these individuals handled this situation the wrong way. All right. But with that being said, let's get into it. A lot of people were talking about Joe Budden apologize to Rory on how he fired him on air. Let me be clear. He apologized for firing Rory on air. Okay. And he also extended that olive branch to Mal. But I still feel that there's hostility between Joe Budden and Rory. Okay, because that's where it originated at. And he did this on his Instagram as well as a live stream I watched yesterday. And I think it's the Ice and Ish one on Patreon. And he also invited his psychiatrist there. And they were going through what took place, why the Joe Budden Podcast imploded from within. And a lot of stuff he was saying in that particular episode was the same type of stuff I've been hearing Rory and Mal talk about. Like, this was a snowball effect, okay? And they never resolve their issues. And the issues were financial, okay? I don't want to hear, the real reason why they broke up because Joe Budden, his ego, he didn't know how to talk to people, he treated people wrong, because Rory and Mal are the last ones to talk about that because they witnessed all this stuff for 6 to 7 years, okay? Joe Budden has a history of disrespecting and treating people wrong, and his ego getting in the way in his relationships and his affairs with ex-employees. Rogenberg even acknowledged this in the early stages of the Joe Budden podcast. That was the main reason why he exit stage left. His issues between DJ Academics, even though they're okay and cool right now. His issues with Charlemagne the God. Joe Budden has a long track record of this. And for Rory and Mal to sit up here and say, well, the main reason why we broke up was because Joe Budden didn't know how to talk to us and how to treat us. I mean, guys, you can't complain when the snake finally bites you in the you-know-where. Okay? Because Joe Budden has a history of that. All right? So it was never an issue with you two guys when you were partners with him. Now all of a sudden it's the main issue, which a lot of people in these social media streets are referring to. I kept telling you guys, and I'm going to keep hammering this point, it has little to do with how Joe Budden treated them or what he said to them. It has more, to do financially, which Joe Budden explained in his live stream and also on this with his Instagram live, and he also explained this on the show, and I believe it's a show because I only watched half of it, and I think it's only the Patreon people can watch this live stream. As of right now, I don't know if it's on his YouTube channel. That's where I normally get Joe Budden's the Joe Budden podcast. I'm not a Patreon member, okay? And I damn sure wasn't going to pay $2 to hear what Rory and Mal had to say. I have sources that can allow me to listen to Rory and Mal's side of things. And basically, he reiterated what the problem was between Joe Budden and really Rory. Rory talking about there was an account issue that they found $400K, and he had an issue with the accountants. And Joe Budden took that personally because, and to me, I can understand how Joe could have took this even though I wouldn't have taken it that way. Rory was implying that the accountants were hiding money. And he did imply that they were lying. And he did imply, without even saying it, that they stole money from them. And Joe explained to him, even when they were host, that 400K was prorated because of the Spotify deal. And I kept telling people, once again, the problems really escalated when Joe ended his partnership with Spotify. Okay? I don't know why you guys want to believe this, that, and the third, but I'm just telling you what I have heard, what I have read in documents and articles, and also in videos, that, the problem really escalated when that Spotify money is no more. Because, Rory and Mal and the rest of the people on the Joe Budden podcast, they were eating off that deal. Nothing wrong with that. Joe Budden was getting a cut from that, but Joe Budden already had money, okay? So that deal wasn't a hill of beans to Joe Budden, but it meant everything in the universe for the other guys, the other cast members, okay? And this is no hate. I'm not, I'm not throwing any shame on these guys. Look, that's a lot of money even for me, okay? So when that deal ended, Joe Budden also talked on his Instagram live, and I watched it again just to check to make sure I'm getting everything accurate and correct, that when that deal was gone, when they exit stage left from the Spotify deal, Joe Budden had to, and I'm sorry about my voice, I'm feeling under the weather. Joe Budden said that that the podcast and the numbers that they were accumulating, as well as the YouTube money, that money could not support the paying the cast members, paying Rory and Mal, paying what it takes to create a podcast show. Okay, all the rigors you have to put in to make this thing work. And I kept telling you guys in every video, okay, everyone looks at the numbers and everyone looks at the money and all that's fine and all, but no one's discussing or talking about how much money it takes to put in to make a product like that, all right? And the Joe Budden podcast, I don't know if a lot of you guys are aware of this, the numbers were shrinking anyway, even with Rory and Mal, okay? In the podcast world, they were no longer in the top 5 at a period of time. And I believe right now they're ranked 15. Now, the funny thing about these categories, they got different lists, like overall, who's the top streaming podcast, hip hop podcast, fashion or movie review podcast, sports podcast. And, right now they're ranked number 15, which is not a huge drop, okay? But it's not the numbers that they were making when they had the Spotify deal. Because at least with the Spotify deal, even when they were down in ranking, they were still making money because they already done signed their deal with Spotify. And Spotify prorated that 400K, the infamous 400K. All right. Now, he also stated that they are partners. All right. So they are partners, but he also talked about a disclaimer in their contract that they're probably not aware of. They're not partners to an extent of they get I forgot. I'm sorry about this. They're not a partner from an extent of they get extra money on top of because of they being partners. But it also states in this description, which he read from the contract, and I kept saying, if you guys feel like Joe Budden did, I mean, which I'm pretty sure Joe Budden did. I know Joe Budden did them dirty, but you guys are the ones have to prove evidence that what Joe Budden did for you, as far he didn't do for you, and you got it already documented on your contract. You guys have to forward that, because you guys are suing Joe Budden. Joe Budden is not suing you. Okay, that's the point I was making when a lot of people say, well, how come Joe Budden don't have to show the contract? No, because Joe Budden doesn't have an issue with the contract. The people who have an issue with the contract, they have to prove documentation and evidence of Joe Budden not honoring his side of the contract. And he basically explained that they're getting revenue from the podcast numbers. They're also getting money if the podcast is sponsored. And between that time, they were not sponsored by Spotify. I mean, the Joe Budden Podcast, since they ended their ties with Spotify, the Joe Budden Podcast isn't sponsored by anybody. Okay? I don't think people are not aware of this. And Joe Budden also stated that he had to pull his own resources to keep the podcast afloat. So translation, when they cut their ties and severed their ties with Spotify, and I kept telling you guys, Rory and Mal felt a certain kind of way because of, Joe Budden ending his ties with Spotify. And they felt a certain kind of way about that, because they even knew that was their main source of income and revenue, was the a Spotify deal. And when that was gone and no more, Spotify, I mean, they don't have a sponsor. So now they have to depend on the revenue as far as what the podcast makes in iTunes, Spotify, and YouTube, if they do appearances. And you have to understand, it was 2 years they didn't do any live appearances, okay? And I know Mal said on their little $2 holler podcast that they noticed the lines were long, but they also noticed that the checks was light when they was doing them appearances. And I feel like, and this is just my opinion, okay? I feel like there was a certain period of time when they had the Spotify deal, and when they didn't have a Spotify deal, the podcast was not making a huge profit, but all of them were still getting paid well beyond what they were supposed to get paid. And the reason why Rory and Mal was getting excellent checks was because Joe Budden had to pull in all of his resources and his money to make sure everyone was still eating. Okay, that's why he was saying in that tirade, he was paying these guys way more than what they should have been getting. He said, and he even clearly said this infamous Instagram live that you guys seem to want to go to, when he apologized to Rory as far as firing him on air. Y'all want to go to this, y'all want to gravitate to this, but you only want to take pieces of it, but you don't want to talk about the rest of it, okay? And he's been on 2 Instagram lives, from my knowledge, okay? But even in this Instagram live, he talked about how the podcast wasn't making the money. So he had to import a lot of his revenue to keep the podcast afloat. And that's what a partner do. When your business is struggling, you have the obligations of doing the following: either pulling other income and resources from your other businesses that are successful, or you sell it. All right? And that's the only 2 options Joe Budden had. And I kept telling you guys in numerous videos, okay, if Joe Budden is paying all the bills, What is Rory and Mal doing? Because it seems like from Joe Budden's words, that they're not paying the freight, okay? They're not paying the majority of the bills. Therefore, they're all just doing their job, all right? And I fully understand now why he considered them as employees, because they didn't have the responsibilities or the obligation to pay for the staff, the health care, the suits, the accountants, these same accountants that Rory said that they made a huge mistake. Uh, he's paying for all that, and Rory and Mal is just collecting a check. And I'm not hating on them, okay? But if you want to be the boss, you have to pay the cost, okay? There's more to it than being a boss than to just sit, collect a check, and there's no hating, no shame, okay? There's more to it, all right? You have to go out and search for deals. You have to go out there. If the business is struggling, you should be the first one taking pay cuts, all right? And it sounded like there was a point of time where Rory and Mal, and including Joe Budden, should have been taking pay cuts because the podcast is not that very profitable. And I don't think it's still profitable because Joe Budden started adding his own income. The Cash App deal was exclusively meant for Joe Budden. He had that on the pull-up episodes. He just integrated into the Joe Budden podcast. Okay? The Patreon deal sounds like it was all for Joe Budden, but he's also integrating that source and allocating it to the Joe Budden podcast because he had to find other sources of income to keep this thing afloat. Okay? And like I said, Rory and Mal, and y'all get mad when y'all think I'm taking sides, but Rory and Mal should have been well aware of that. Now, if you want to be partners, you should have already know this. Okay? This should not be discussed. This is not a topic. Okay? If the podcast is not doing the numbers and is not making the profit, okay, and you clearly have the evidence in front of you, all right, now what is the next stage? Okay, it shouldn't be, well, we feel like we're being we're being underpaid and unappreciated. No, you need to tie your bootstraps up and say, well, okay, if we're doing X and Y, we need to do A, B, and C, which is we need to cut our salaries down to keep this podcast afloat. And I kind of knew that when I first made these episodes, that the podcast is not hidden. Okay. And I can go as far as back as on $1 Million Worth of Game when they had their issues with Joe Budden Podcast. Gilly the Kid even mentioned this. Gilly the Kid mentioned this, that they're not doing the same numbers like they used to because now there's more competition out there in the podcast world. Okay, they're not highly rated. Or and Gilly the Kid even admitted that even in the hip hop world, the Joe Budden Podcast is not the number one podcast. It's the $1 Million Worth of Game podcast. Okay. So that should indicate to you guys that this is not a very profitable podcast. Okay. And, Joe Budden probably saw this day coming where the podcast was not making a lot of money. All right. And Joe Budden embellished a few things. And I felt like he embellished a few things because of a pride factor. And I still think Joe Budden is holding a lot of things, and holding a lot of things that he's not talking about. But I also feel like that contract that his lawyers created, and even in that live stream, they have the same agent. Okay, that's the one mistake you should never do. You should not have the same agent. Okay. And I could not understand, why would Joe Budden and Rory and Mal all have the same agency? Okay. That literally made no sense. And that just even furthers my proof of, I feel like Rory and Mal, this is a little bit too much for them. This arena, they're not aware of how this thing works. And that's no shame. I'm not throwing no shame on them. Okay. But I'm just calling it like it is. Okay. I feel like they are not aware of what it fully takes to run a podcast, a successful podcast, a podcast business. Now, they may tell you about what they have done in the past in other arenas, and they have. They have accomplished a lot in other arenas. But when it comes to podcasting, they're considered babies. And I'm not talking about crying babies, but I'm just saying they don't know what it fully takes to run a podcast. I feel like they know a little bit. I think they're more educated now doing their own thing versus the Joe Budden podcast. And I always kept saying this. These guys, and even Joe Budden admitted this, and a lot of people have admitted this too, when it's concerning Rory and Mal. They didn't understand why they didn't branch out and do their own things, because it's not a contract issue. Joe Budden wasn't holding them back for them to do their own thing. They could have done their own thing. They could have done their own thing under the Joe Budden Network. Okay, have their own podcast. Okay. A lot of people were saying, well, why y'all didn't just do your own thing when the Joe Budden podcast was at its highest? Okay, capitalize off your success. They just rested on their success, and now the success is not there. They're not doing the numbers, and they're not doing, and they're not making that same type of money. And he even talked about a story about signing a deal with Titus, with Jay-Z. And Rory, he was trying to broker a deal with Titus, and he gave them the number, and they were holding back on that number because they wanted a lower number, because they still in deliberation. So they feel like they can get the Joe Budden podcast at a reduced number. Rory even invaded that bargaining discussion. Okay. And he talked about the story, how really Rory really was trying to, Rory didn't really help them get that deal. Jay-Z himself brokered the deal with Joe Budden. I don't know if it's at that number Joe Budden wanted, but he had to get that deal done with Jay-Z present. Okay. So he was even discussing that, and he didn't really talk any further about it. He didn't add any more information about it. He could have been embellishing some. I'm pretty sure he embellished some on that particular story. But that just goes to show you, you're trying to go into a boardroom and you really don't know the number Joe Budden was trying to pursue and how to make these deals done, which was funny. That just indicates to me that even Rory knew that this podcast was struggling because it wasn't making the money like it used to make. Okay. And Joe was the one who got them the Spotify money. Okay. So you're cool when Joe Budden gets that Spotify money, and y'all all are eating off that Spotify money, and y'all all are making hellified money on that Spotify money. But when that Spotify money ends and there's nobody sponsoring the podcast, okay, now you want to take it upon yourself to try to get another deal. Okay. And I'm not saying that's the wrong thing to do, but I'm also thinking that's like too many cooks in the kitchen. All right. rested on your laurels and wanted you pretty much was living, I mean, and it's going to sound like hate, it's going to sound like shame, but look, I have to call it like it is. You was resting on your laurels when Joe Budden got that Spotify deal. You wasn't in the room when he got that Spotify deal, and you didn't even care if you didn't have no issues because you knew Joe Budden was going to get y'all the bag. And I feel like this is a clear example of fumbling the bag. Joe Budden, Rory, and Mal all fumbled the bag royally, okay? And it just goes to show that when it comes to podcasting, I feel like the business side, I feel like Rory needs to establish and learn a little bit more. And I have seen this on tons of podcasts and this is when the success is there and when that money is rolling and you have one person that's not familiar or aware of the money, and as soon as the money starts drying up and the numbers are no longer at its apex, that person, that one individual that was accustomed to getting that money and now that money is no longer there, they be the main ones. That's where the fallout happens. Okay, there's no fallout when it starts because you're under fully aware that when you start something, you're going to have to make sacrifices because the views are not going to be there, meaning the money's not going to be there. But when the money is at an apex and the views are there, and now you're getting sponsorship deals, now you're living your best life. But when it slowly slips away, now there's an issue. Now there's a problem. I feel like a lot of people have fear, like, I don't want to go back starting all over again because I wasn't making money starting all over again. And I've seen this on a lot of podcasts, okay? And it's always people that are consider themselves friends, family, and, that's the main ones, okay? And it's sad that all three of these guys screwed up royally with this podcast. I feel like, if anything, Joe Budden, Rory, and Mal, since y'all all want to be, since y'all partners, I feel like to salvage and to save this podcast, I feel like y'all should have cut back. Yes, you too, Joe Budden, Rory, and Mal, y'all should have took cutbacks to support the rest of the podcast, making sure the staff get their money, okay? And we was in a pandemic, okay? And that's what a lot of major corporations were doing. They were taking cutbacks so the rest of the people can eat, so they can have food on their table. And Rory, Mal, and Joe Budden did not want to do that. Now, I'll give them this credit, okay? On Joe Budden's side, he started integrating other money that he was making from other resources. Okay, I will give you some props there. Okay, and Rory and Mal, I will give them props because Rory, that he started noticing the money was dwindling. Okay, and Mal as well. Even though Mal wants to sugarcoat it and cover it as it was just a respect factor, he disrespected me. I'm not you're not going to make yourself into a victim of that. You knew what you was getting into when you was dealing with Joe Budden, because Joe Budden has a long track record and a history of disrespecting people, calling people all types of names. And y'all would sit back and kiki laugh about it. But now when it's your turn, when the clown turns on you, now all of a sudden it's an issue. Now all of a sudden you want to be treated as a victim. Okay? We all know what this, adults know what this is about. This is about money. Okay? the money just simply wasn't coming at a boatload. Okay, there was a hole in the roof. All right, there was many holes in the roof. And I told you guys it started with the Spotify deal. A lot of people still to this day want to argue that point, saying that's not true. I kept telling you guys it has little to do with a respect factor. It has more to do with the finances and the business. Now, if y'all want to throw in this this disrespect factor, I'm not going to hold you. I'm not going to get upset with you about that, but it had little to do with that. And it's a shame that all three of these guys could not work out their differences. They was just going through their differences. There's a difference between working out your differences, coming to a resolution, and just going through your differences. And that's what for these guys to be so tight, they couldn't work out their differences. Okay. And it's just sad. It's just really sad. And they should be ashamed of themselves. All three of them, Rory, Mal, and Joe Budden. It makes them look stupid right now. Now, I was going to do let me go ahead and do a separate video on Kevin Hart, because I got a whole lot of stuff for Kevin Hart. This video is already too long, so I'll holler at you guys later. Deuces.